In the latter part of 1944, America was about to return to the Philippines. For more than 2 years, America gradually reclaimed the islands in the Pacific that were occupied by Japan. Because of this, they slowly got closer to the Philippines. The Philippines was important to Japan because it was a main route for their ships and supplies. This was where materials for the war and oil from Southeast Asia passed through. If America recaptured the Philippines, one of Japan's most important supply lines would be cut off. Now, what really happened? Let's find out. But before we start the discussion, I'd like to ask you for a like and please subscribe to our channel. This is a huge help for us content creators. So let's get started. While American officials were discussing where to attack next, there was one person who already had a clear goal, and that was General Douglas MacArthur. He believed that it was time to return to the Philippines. In 1942, he was forced to leave the country as the Japanese advanced rapidly. Before he left, he promised that he would return, and he intended to keep that promise. His initial plan was to start in Mindanao and then move to Leyte. For MacArthur, Leyte was important because if America captured it, it would be easier for them to reclaim other parts of the Philippines, including Manila. While the plan was being made, American aircraft carriers were helping to destroy Japan's defenses. Under the leadership of Admiral William Halsey, Task Force 38 launched massive air attacks in different areas. Hundreds of Japanese planes were destroyed. Because of this, the Americans noticed that Japan's defenses around the Philippines were weaker than they had expected. Because of the good results, Halsey suggested not to wait until December for the attack on Leyte. It would be better to do it earlier. The main American military leaders agreed, but there was a consequence to this rush. Not all preparations were fully completed. The soldiers who would attack Leyte would be protected by the 7th Fleet. However, many of their battleships were already old ships. At the same time, the season of strong storms in the Pacific was also approaching. If the weather worsened, it would be difficult to use the airfields on land. Because of this, MacArthur insisted that Halsey's carriers stay nearby to provide additional support from the air. Admiral Chester Nimitz agreed, but he had one more order for Halsey. If there was an opportunity to destroy a large part of the Japanese Navy, that should be the top priority. In other words, if Halsey saw the main Japanese fleet, he could leave other tasks behind and focus all his strength on destroying it. In fact, MacArthur didn't know about this order, and later on, that detail would become very important. Meanwhile, Japan was also preparing for the American attack they were expecting. They called their plan Show 1 or Victory 1. But even some Japanese officials didn't have much confidence in this plan. At this point in the war, Japan had already lost many ships, airplanes, and skilled pilots. Their strength was far from what it was in the early years of the war. Nevertheless, they still had some very powerful warships. These included the Yamato and Musashi, which were among the largest battleships ever built in history. They also had destroyers capable of launching long-range torpedo attacks. But even with these ships, America was still stronger. They had more carriers, more airplanes, more skilled pilots, and more supplies. And Japan had another problem. Their navy and land army didn't always agree with each other. They often made separate plans, even though they had the same enemy. Because of this, coordinating their operations became even more difficult. While Japan was studying where America would attack next, they prepared for various possible targets. One of these was the Philippines, and another was Formosa, which is now known as Taiwan. Because they also lacked fuel, their large fleets couldn't just move around easily. They needed to be sure where America would really attack before they made a move. This means that even if America started its invasion, it would still take several days before Japan's main armada could arrive. Japanese officials knew this, but they were still hoping to find an opportunity to attack the American ships. By October, the Japanese commander, Admiral Suemo Toyoda, was convinced that Leyte would be the target, so he divided their fleet into 3 main forces. The strongest was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's Marsam. This included Japan's giant battleships. They planned to pass through the San Bernardino Strait and attack Leyte Gulf from the north. At the same time, there was another force that would enter from the south. There was also a separate group of ships that would support them. Meanwhile, Japan's remaining carriers under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had a different role. They were not expected to win in a direct battle. Instead, they would be used as bait. The goal was to lure the American carriers away to give Japan's main fleet a chance to break through. This plan was very complicated, and for it to succeed, the movements of all the forces had to be perfectly coordinated. The problem was similar plans had already failed several times in the past. So even though many Japanese officials were following orders, there were also many who doubted whether this would really succeed. Now, as the American invasion of Leyte was approaching, the Japanese armada was also beginning to move. Admiral Suemo Toyoda ordered the start of the Show 1 plan. The goal was simple: destroy the American ships before they could fully establish their forces in Leyte. But Japan immediately encountered problems. On paper, their ships were supposed to reach Leyte Gulf within a few days. But in reality, it wasn't that easy. The refueling of some of their ships was delayed. In Brunei, there were also submarines that needed to prepare before they could join the operation. What's even more unfortunate is that they were severely lacking in skilled pilots. There were new pilots who weren't really trained to land planes on aircraft carriers. Because of this, they had to use cranes to transfer some planes onto the carriers. As time went by, they fell even further behind schedule. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita divided his forces into different groups. Their plan was to attack Leyte from different directions. They hoped to confuse the Americans and create an opportunity to break through. But many of Kurita's officers were not convinced. Their original plan was to attack at night. That was what they were more used to. That's when they were more comfortable. But because of the delays, there was a big possibility that they would have to fight during the day. This was more dangerous because American planes could easily spot their ships. Kurita knew the situation was difficult. So before they set out, he tried to boost the morale of his men. He said that sometimes in war, miracles happen. He was hoping that maybe this was Japan's chance. After this, his armada continued sailing towards the Philippines. To save fuel, they passed through the Palawan Passage, but this route was dangerous. It was known as a place where American submarines often kept watch, and that's exactly what happened. On October 23, 2 American submarines discovered Kurita's armada. They immediately attacked. 2 heavy Japanese cruisers sank. One of them was Kurita's flagship. Another cruiser was badly damaged. This was a major blow for Japan. But while that was happening, they also achieved a victory. The remaining Japanese planes from Formosa were transferred to the Philippines to help with the operation. They were not able to launch many attacks, but a bomb hit the aircraft carrier USS Princeton. It pierced the ship and exploded in the hangar. A series of explosions followed. While other ships tried to put out the fire, the situation got even worse. Later, Princeton's torpedo storage exploded. The explosion was extremely powerful. Hundreds of American sailors were killed or wounded. The carrier could no longer be saved. Eventually, it was sunk by the American forces themselves so that it wouldn't fall into enemy hands. This was one of Japan's biggest victories during those days. But this did not change the overall situation. America still had more ships and airplanes. Meanwhile, Admiral Halsey's Task Force 38 was scattered in different locations. Some groups were far from the main battle. Because of this, the entire American force could not gather immediately. When Kurita's armada entered the Sibuyan Sea, only one task group was immediately aware, the one that blocked him. Even though this was not the strongest American group, they immediately began launching air attacks. One of their main targets was the giant battleship Musashi. It was the same as the Yamato. It was one of the largest and most powerful battleships ever made by Japan. Next, the American planes arrived. They bombed the Musashi. It was also hit by many torpedoes. The ship gradually filled with water, but the Musashi was tough. With every attack, it kept on fighting. It fired at the American planes using its numerous anti-aircraft guns. However, as time went on, the damage got worse and worse. In the end, it was forced to retreat, but the American planes still didn't stop. They kept following and attacking it. By nightfall, more than a dozen bombs and over 10 torpedoes had already hit Musashi. The ship couldn't take it anymore. It slowly sank into the sea. Along with it, around 1,000 crew members drowned. This was a tremendous loss for Japan. What's even more surprising is that throughout Musashi's entire service in the war, it never fired its main cannons at an enemy ship. After the loss of Musashi, Kurita temporarily retreated. When American pilots saw this, they thought he had withdrawn completely. They believed the threat was over, but they were wrong. After a few hours, Kurita resumed sailing towards Leyte. Most of the Americans did not notice this. While the battle in the Sibuyan Sea was taking place, another major battle was beginning in the south. Admiral Shoji Nishimura's forces were approaching the Surigao Strait, but they were discovered by American planes before they could arrive. Because of this, the 7th Fleet had enough time to prepare. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf positioned his ships. They found the perfect spot for an ambush. It was like a trap at sea. They let the Japanese get close before attacking. The American destroyers were the first to charge. They launched torpedoes. 2 Japanese destroyers sank. The battleship Fuso was also hit. After that, the big ships started firing at each other. This was the last time in history that battleships faced each other in a traditional battle using their big cannons. But it quickly became clear who had the advantage. The Americans had more ships. They also had a better position. Next, the Japanese ships were hit. In the end, the battleship Yamashiro also sank. Almost all of Nishimura's forces were wiped out. At first, it looked like Admiral Shima would arrive to help, but when he saw what was happening, he decided to retreat. He didn't want to risk his remaining ships in a battle that was almost over. At this point, another big problem was heading America's way. Around 4 in the afternoon on October 24, Task Force 38 discovered Admiral Ozawa's carriers. And here, Admiral Halsey would face one of the most important decisions of the entire battle. On October 25, 1944, a major mistake was about to cause disaster for the American side. Admiral William Halsey had 2 options. He could guard the San Bernardino Strait to block Admiral Kurita's armada, or he could chase the Japanese aircraft carriers to the north. The problem was, he chose the second option. He took almost the entire strength of Task Force 38 to chase the Japanese carriers. For Halsey, this was the chance to finally destroy the remaining carrier force of Japan. What he didn't know was, this was exactly what Japan wanted. Admiral Ozawa's carriers were serving as decoys. The real threat was Kurita's armada, which was already approaching Leyte. Because of the chaotic communication, the 7th Fleet did not immediately learn what had happened. Admiral Thomas Kincaid thought that Halsey still had ships guarding the San Bernardino Strait, but there were none left. Kurita had already slipped through and was heading straight for the American ships at Leyte Gulf. By 6 a.m., Kurita's armada spotted Taffy. 3. This was a small group of escort carriers, destroyers, and escort ships of the United States. These were not made to fight against large battleships. They were made to provide support to the soldiers on the ground. When both sides saw each other, they were both surprised. The Americans did not expect that there would be large Japanese ships in the area. Kurita also did not expect that the force he would face would be that small. After just a few minutes, the shooting started. From a long distance, the Japanese battleships fought against the American ships. Included among them was the Yamato, the largest battleship in the world at that time. Its shells were enormous. Even without a direct hit, they could damage ships when the shells exploded in the water near the target. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, the commander of Taffy, 3 immediately took action. He knew they couldn't win in a direct battle, so the first thing he did was move his carriers away. At the same time, he ordered all planes to take off, even if some of them were underarmed, even if some of them had almost no ammunition left. What mattered was that they could disrupt the enemy. The American ships also released thick smoke. Because the weather was humid, the smoke lingered for a long time, making it difficult for the Japanese to see their targets. As the carriers retreated, 3 American destroyers made an almost desperate move. They charged straight at the larger Japanese ships. It was almost like a small boat chasing a giant. They knew their chances of survival were slim, but they also knew they had to buy time for the carriers behind them. They launched torpedoes. One of these hit a Japanese cruiser and took it out of the battle, but in exchange, they suffered heavy damage. Next, they were fired upon by Japanese battleships and cruisers. One of the bravest American ships to fight was the USS Johnstone. It attacked repeatedly, even though the enemy was many times larger. In the end, it was also sunk. The USS Howell suffered the same fate after being hit by numerous shells. While all this was happening, American planes continued to attack. Many of them no longer had proper bombs. Some didn't have torpedoes anymore, but they didn't stop. They kept charging repeatedly to disrupt the Japanese ships. Because of this, the Japanese were forced to maneuver and change direction. Some of their cruisers were gradually damaged. Some cruisers were also gradually damaged. In the midst of the chaos, Kurita had a misunderstanding. He thought he was fighting America's large fleet carriers. He also thought that more American forces were on their way. Because of this, he began to hesitate. As the battle went on, the confusion intensified. Some of his ships were missing. There was Palio. As the battle went on, the confusion intensified. Some of his ships were missing, some cruiser crews were being lost, and he still couldn't see the whole situation. After the long battle, he made a decision that surprised many. He ordered his armada to retreat. Instead of continuing the attack on Leyte, he turned back toward the San Bernardino Strait. For America, this was an incredible stroke of luck. If Kurita had continued his attack, he could have reached the transport ships and supply ships in Leyte, and the damage to America's operations could have been even greater. But even though Japan's main fleet had already retreated, the danger was not over yet. Just a few hours later, a new kind of attack struck the American ships. This was the first large-scale use of kamikaze. The word kamikaze means divine wind. In this method, the pilot deliberately crashes his plane into the enemy ship. In the past, there were pilots who did this on their own when they had no hope of returning. But by late 1944, Japan made this an official war tactic. The reason was simple. They were severely lacking in skilled pilots, modern airplanes, and enough fuel. Their commanders knew it was difficult to stop America's advance. So they believed that a plane crashing directly into a target would cause more damage than a normal attack. At Leyte, the first large-scale kamikaze operation began, and it immediately caused damage. One of those hit was the USS St. Lo. After being hit by a kamikaze, the ship exploded and eventually sank. The Americans were shocked by this new tactic, and for Japan, this was just the beginning. In the following months, kamikaze attacks would increase even more as American forces drew closer to Japan itself. At first glance, kamikaze seemed extremely dangerous. And it's true, many American ships were damaged because of this. Some even sank. But as the war went on, America learned how to fight against it. One of their most important weapons was the more modern anti-aircraft system. Before, soldiers had to guess when their shells would explode in the air, but eventually they used a new type of fuse. It had the ability to detect when an airplane was near. When the target was close enough, it would automatically explode. Because of this, it became easier for them to hit approaching airplanes. But this wasn't the most important reason. Radar was still more important. Through radar, the Americans could detect if an airplane was coming while it was still far away. If they spotted the enemy early, they could immediately send fighter planes to intercept them. And if a kamikaze was intercepted far from the target, its chances of reaching the ship became very small. In other words, the earlier they spotted the enemy, the greater the chance the attack would fail. Because of this, the effectiveness of the kamikaze gradually decreased. Many ships were still hit, though, but that wasn't enough to change the course of the war. In fact, most of the time, it wasn't the large aircraft carriers that were hit. More often, it was the destroyers and other smaller ships that were hit. This was because they were the first ones encountered by the Japanese pilots. They were also often the ones with radar that warned the main fleet. Because of this, they became the first targets. By the end of the war, thousands of Japanese pilots had been sent on kamikaze missions. They destroyed ships and they also caused many casualties on the American side. But they were not able to stop the Allied forces from approaching Japan. In the end, the kamikaze did not change the outcome of the war. Meanwhile, historians are still discussing Admiral Takeo Kurita's decision to this day. Many are asking, why did he retreat? Why didn't he continue into Leyte Gulf? Some believe that he could have reached the American ships and caused greater damage, but there are also other perspectives. At that time, his men were already exhausted. He had already lost some ships. Many ships were also damaged. He also didn't know the full situation around him. He thought he was still surrounded by larger American forces. He also believed that there were still many aircraft carriers waiting for him. Aside from this, he was also running low on fuel. And even if he managed to enter Leyte Gulf, it was possible that the important target had already left. Because of this, he chose to retreat. Until now, this remains one of the most debated decisions in the history of naval warfare. While Kurita was retreating, another battle was beginning in the north. There, Admiral Ozawa's carriers were waiting. These were the carriers that were used as bait to lure Halsey away from Leyte. And at this point, they had successfully accomplished their mission. They had drawn away the main American force, but there was a price for this. Now they would become the target. In the early morning of October 25th, the Americans launched a massive attack against Ozawa's armada. Next, planes took off from the American carriers. Meanwhile, only a few Japanese planes remained. In fact, they were only able to send a handful for defense. They were no longer like Japan's once powerful carrier force. In the early part of the war, one of America's main targets was the Zuikaku. This ship was important because it was one of the last remaining carriers that took part in the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. It was then hit by bombs and torpedoes. It gradually tilted more and more as water flooded in. When the captain saw that there was no hope for the ship, he ordered his crew to abandon it. After a short while, the Zuikaku sank. Along with it, the other Japanese carriers also sank. In just one day, almost the entire remaining carrier force of Japan was wiped out. This was a huge blow, because even though they still had a few carriers on paper, they barely had enough planes and skilled pilots to use them as real weapons. However, Halsey still hadn't completely destroyed the entire Japanese armada. While he was busy in the north, Kurita continued to slip away. When the 7th Fleet asked for help from the south, it was too late to chase the main Japanese force. In the end, some Japanese ships escaped, but the result was clear. Japan's ability to conduct large-scale operations at sea was gradually disappearing. And after Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy would never recover as a major force in the war. At the end of the battle at Cape Engano, the largest naval engagement in history was gradually coming to an end. This was the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Even today, many historians still debate exactly where the battle began and ended. This is because many battles happened simultaneously in different parts of the Philippines. There were battles at sea, there were battles in the air, and there were also battles on land in Leyte. But one thing is clear, Japan suffered tremendous losses. Thousands of soldiers and sailors were killed. They also lost many ships that could never be replaced. On the American side, there were also heavy losses. Many ships were damaged. Many soldiers were killed and wounded. But overall, the damage to Japan was still greater. At first glance, the result seems very clear. America won. But as the years go by, one question keeps coming up. Could they have done more? Many critics point to Admiral William Halsey. According to them, he fell into Japan's trap. While he was chasing Ozawa's carriers in the north, Kurita's armada slipped through the San Bernardino Strait. If only he had left a larger force to guard the area, Kurita might not have gotten close to Samar. Some also say that he placed too much importance on destroying Japan's carriers rather than protecting Leyte Gulf. But there is another perspective. According to those who support Halsey, it's easy to judge a decision when we already know what happened after the battle. At that time, the information in front of him was different. What he knew was that Kurita's armada had already been severely damaged. He thought it was no longer a major threat. Meanwhile, the Japanese carriers were still seen as very dangerous targets. Besides that, he also had orders to prioritize the enemy carriers. When these were spotted, America had another problem at that time. Their command structure was disorganized. It wasn't always clear who should communicate with whom. There were times when information was slow to reach its destination, and there were also times when commanders had different understandings of the situation. So even though America won, the battle also revealed some weaknesses in their system. Despite this, there is no doubt that this was a major victory for America. Even some Japanese officials admitted that they were thoroughly defeated, and to be honest, many of their commanders no longer really believed that the Show 1 plan would succeed even before it began. America already had a huge advantage. They had more ships, they had more airplanes, they had more skilled pilots, and their ability to supply and bring in new equipment was much stronger. Even if Japan's plan had been perfect, many historians still believe that their chances of winning were very small. Another big problem was their main objective. They wanted to stop the American invasion of Leyte. But by the time their armada arrived, America had already landed many soldiers and equipment. It was already too late. Even if they managed to enter Leyte Gulf, it would be difficult for them to change the situation on the ground. This is why many experts believe that it was almost impossible for Japan to achieve its objective at that point in the war. And after Leyte Gulf, their situation became even worse. Even though the war was not yet completely over, the backbone of the Japanese Navy was almost broken. They lost many battleships. They lost carriers, and most of all, they lost skilled personnel who were not easily replaced. From this point on, Japan was never able to carry out a large naval operation like before. But this doesn't mean that the fight for the Philippines was over. American and Filipino soldiers were gradually advancing against the Japanese forces. For General Douglas MacArthur, this was the beginning of fulfilling his promise. The promise he made in 1942, "I shall return." But reclaiming the whole Philippines would not be easy. Many more months of intense battles were ahead, many more lives would be lost, and many more cities would be destroyed before the war finally ended. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the fall of Nazi Germany in Europe was also approaching. As the Allied forces closed in on Berlin, America was also getting closer to Japanese territory itself. The Battle of Leyte Gulf did not end the Second World War, but it revealed an important truth. At this point in the war, the question was no longer whether Japan would win. The only question left was how long it would take before their fight finally ended.